joining me. This video series is going to focus on the history of women throughout the ages, and this is going to be the first part of a series that I'm going to be doing on women and their history. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is the history of marriage. During the 1800s, women were generally trapped in their homes and would only perform domestic chores and duties. Nature and the society had given them roles as the home keepers, ethical keepers for the home and the entire society, as well as housewives for their families. The roles as housewives were to bear children, take care of the young ones, as well as submitting to the husbands. Socially, women were considered weaker, hence unequal to their male counterparts. Some people would compare such a condition as slavery. Women had no control of their lives. Everything was entirely controlled by the men in the society. First, their fathers and brothers would control them when they were still young, and when they were married, their husbands would finally control them. No life for a woman, I think you'll agree. Women's roles in societies in the 1800s. So the woman's key purpose was to look for a husband, give birth, and take care of their husbands throughout their entire lives. It was a taboo for a woman to remain single. In fact, single women were scorned and pitied by the society. A woman owned property when she was still in her father's house, but after she got married, property ownership shifted to the husband. A practice that I think is hugely unfair. The husband had a right to access everything that a woman had, as well as her own body. For these women, marriage was a lifelong commitment. Women were not supposed to divorce. They were expected to live with their husbands, even if it meant to live in a miserable marriage. And many women were miserable. Divorce was highly punishable, and the woman would always fall a victim. This did not only undermine their physical requirements, but also destroyed their opportunities of having any kind of freedom. It subdued their voice of influence, thus giving them no hope of attaining social recognition. Women's life was hell. No opportunity to be anything but owned, first by their fathers and then by their husbands. Nothing more than slavery. Women were not allowed to venture into any other activities apart from taking care of her family. The husband was the sole breadwinner of the family. The only source of finance was the husband, hence the only chance for women to be economically protected was for them to marry men who were financially secure. This made them more dependent on men, and if the man died, they would be left with no source of income apart from their husband's savings, if the husband saved any money. The society looked at women as asexual beings, people with neither feelings nor a life of their own. However, during the 1800s, women's movements became so effective that women began to challenge the social, traditional, economical, as well as the political intellectuals that had hindered them for a long time. This was the starting point for the turnabout of their roles in society. Throughout history, women have had less equal legal rights and occupation opportunities, hence less representation compared to their male counterparts. Motherhood and wifehood were considered as their most major professions. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, most women had won the right to vote and had increased their chances to access education and other professions initially considered for men. Marriage was considered very essential and significant for the sake of the stability of the society. Women were therefore expected to be very obedient and submissive in order to have a happy and stable marriage. How convenient. During these times, education was a disputable topic, and it was the first topic that motivated women into protesting. However, not a single feminist could come up with a means through which education would be equalized between girls and boys. Only the daughters of rich parents would get formal education. Educated girls were, however, perceived as unattractive sexually, thus getting marriage was a big struggle for them. Does that not show how insecure men were? In the 1800s, childbirth was agonizing and perilous. There were no anesthetics with the exception of opium, which was rarely used. At the time, ignorant men believed that women were supposed to suffer during childbirth, as the Bible states. It was the price women were to pay for the original sin. forget the fact that Adam was also part of the sin. Most women gave birth at home during the 1800s, usually with the help of family and friends. Some women practiced as midwives, however. They did not have any formal training. Doctors were a last resort when there was a concern that the mother might die, but many times the doctors actually brought more risks than actual help. The danger of infection from a doctor's assistance was incredibly high. In the 1800s, doctors did not have training in obstetrics. The biggest risks for women during childbirth were prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, and infection. If the infant was breech, feet first, or sideways, the labor would be long and the danger increased. Mostly unsuccessful, frantic, and horribly painful attempts would be made to turn the babies. In cases when the labor would go on for 2 or more days, the doctor may try to use devices called forceps to pull the baby out, at times crushing it in an attempt to save the life of the mother. In the 1800s, there was nothing a midwife or doctor could do to stop the bleeding, and many women simply bled to death. Infection was another huge risk of giving birth. In the 1800s, it was referred to as childbed fever. The actual cause of death, though, was blood poisoning or sepsis. Bearing a child is still one of the most dangerous things a woman can do. It's the 6th most common cause of death among women aged 20 to 34 in the United States. If you look at the black box warning on a packet of birth control pills, you'll notice that at most ages the risk of death from taking the pills is less than if you don't take them. That's because they're so good at preventing pregnancy, and pregnancy kills. The risk flips only after age 35 because birth control pills increase the risk of stroke. Guys, you know what makes an excellent 35th birthday present for your partner? Getting a vasectomy. In the United States today, about 15 women die in pregnancy or childbirth per 100,000 live births. That's way too many. But a century ago, it was more than 600 women per 100,000 births. In the 1600s and 1700s, the death rate was twice that. By some estimates, between 1 and 1.5% of women giving birth died. Note that the rate is per birth, so the lifetime risk of dying in childbirth was much higher, perhaps 4%. By the late stages of pregnancy and during childbirth, almost anything can go wrong. Pregnant women are sapped of energy. They are susceptible to infectious disease. The baby's head is enormous. Labor takes much longer in humans than in other primates. Women often pushed for days. Historically, women died of puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, or postpartum sepsis or infection usually contracted during the childbirth. Sorry about my pronunciation, guys. Hemorrhage, eclampsia, dangerously high blood pressure, and organ damage. That's what killed Sybil in Downton Abbey and obstructed labor. In the delightfully named book, Get Me Out, A History of Childbirth from the Garden of Eden to the Sperm Bank, Randy Hutter Epstein describes the state-of-art treatment. Before forceps, babies stuck in the birth canal were dragged out by the doctor, often in pieces. Sometimes midwives cracked the skull, killing the newborn but sparing the mother. Sometimes doctors broke the pubic bone, which often killed the mother but spared the baby. Doctors had an entire armamentarium of gruesome gadgets to hook, stab, and rip apart a hard-to-deliver baby. Many of these gadgets had an uncanny resemblance to medieval torture tools. In the mid-1800s, Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that doctors in his hospital in Vienna were spreading puerperal fever when they went directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies, but his work was mostly ignored. There were many reasons for this. He was apparently a red pill. The methods he suggested for sanitizing the hands were caustic and difficult, and most doctors attending births at home hadn't been near a corpse. Doctors were also offended by the accusation that their filth was responsible for deadly disease. Gentlemen didn't have dirty hands. Madness. So men didn't want women to be more educated and therefore less dependent on them, and therefore the laws were designed to benefit men more than women. Effectively, women were nothing more than slaves. They were owned. The only subject that girls were taught in school was language, reading, and writing. Other courses included wifely responsibilities and activities such as knitting, midwife, cooking, and weaving, among others. Women began to form women's rights movements, which helped them in protesting against slavery as well as men's dictatorships. These movements led to revolution, which eventually led to the constitutional amendment processes, which brought about the eradication of slavery. This was a great achievement on the women's history, since they could freely speak out their views. In the 1800s, women became resistant to the oppression by men, and they wanted to become totally independent. As a result, they protested for equal education opportunities and religion activism. It was not that easy. Women had to fight both men and fellow women. Men in general overlooked upon feminists, and those women who were still dedicated to the traditional way of life did not want to hear anything concerning female independence. The only place in which women got total support was the church, which also had its own interests. Women became successful in these reform movements, and for the first time in history, men became challenged by the female domination. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, women and women's organizations not only worked to gain the right to vote, they also worked for broad-based economic and political equality and social reforms. Between 1880 and 1910, the number of women employed in the United States increased from 2.6 million to 7.8 million. Suffrage. Anne Kenny was an English working-class suffragette and social feminist, and became a leading figure in the Women's Social and Political Union. She co-founded its first branch in London with Minnie Baldock. Kenny attracted the attention of the press and public in 1905 when she and Christabel Pankhurst were imprisoned for several days for assault and obstruction related to the questioning of Sir Edward Grey at a Liberal rally in Manchester on the issue of votes for women. The incident is credited with inaugurating a new phase in the struggle for women's suffrage in the UK with the adoption of militant tactics. Dame Christabel Harriet Pankhurst was a British suffragette born in Manchester, England. She was a co-founder of the Women's Social and Political Union. She directed its militant actions from exile in France from 1912 to 1913. Ladies, it's due to women like this that you now have rights in society. In many countries, women were treated like second-class citizens. They were barely educated and in many cases owned by the men. In Mesopotamia, women in ancient Sumer could buy, own, sell, and inherit property. They could engage in commerce and testify in court as witnesses. In ancient Egypt, women enjoyed the same rights under the law as a man. However, rightful entitlements depended upon social class. Landed property descended in the female line from mother to daughter, and women were entitled to administer their own property. Women in ancient Egypt could buy, sell, be a partner in legal contracts, be executor in wills, and witness to legal documents, bring court action, and adopt children. Egypt, thankfully, was very progressive and respectful of women's rights. Ancient Rome. Roman law, similar to Athenian law, was created by men in favor of men. Women had no public voice and no public role, which only improved after the 1st century to the 6th century BCE. Free-born women of ancient Rome were citizens who enjoyed legal privileges and protections that did not exist to non-citizens or slaves. Roman society, however, was patriarchal, and women could not vote, hold public office, or serve in the military. Women of the upper classes exercised political influence through marriage and motherhood. During the Roman Republic, the mothers of the Gracchus brothers and of Julius Caesar were noted as exemplary women who advanced the careers of their sons. During the imperial period, women of the emperor's family could acquire considerable political power and were regularly depicted in official art and on coinage. The central core of the Roman society was the pater familias, or the male head of the household, who exercised his authority over all his children, servants, and wife. Girls had equal inheritance rights with boys if their father died without leaving a will. In ancient Greece, although most women lacked political and equal rights in the city-states of ancient Greece, they enjoyed a certain freedom of movement until the Archaic Age. Records also exist of women in ancient Delphi, Gortyn, Thessaly, Megara, and Sparta owning land, the most prestigious form of private property at the time. However, after the Archaic Age, legislators began to enact laws enforcing gender segregation, resulting in decreased rights for women. Women in classical Athens had no legal personhood and were assumed to be part of the oikos, headed by the male kyrios. Until marriage, women were under the guardianship of their father or other male relative. Once married, the husband became a woman's kyrios. As women were barred from conducting legal proceedings, the kyrios would do so on their behalf. In classical Athens, women were also barred from becoming poets, scholars, politicians, or artists. During the Hellenistic period in Athens, the philosopher Aristotle thought that women would bring disorder and evil. Therefore, it was best to keep women separate from the rest of society. This separation would entail living in a room called a gynaikeon, while looking after the duties in the home and having very little exposure with the male world. This was also to ensure that wives only had legitimate children from their husbands. Athenian women received little education except home tutorship for basic skills such as spinning, weaving, cooking, and some knowledge of money. Their ignorance is maddening. Ancient Greece, the mistreatment of women. Ancient Greece really is a tell-all tale of democracy. However, the women would beg to differ. That acclaimed institution overtly outcast them outside of Sparta. The word rights for women itself felt wrong. It was perhaps the fear that women would flee their oppression and truly live the moment they escaped. Or maybe it was just the excitement of marrying husbands twice their age at the ripe age of 13. A woman governing herself? That would be preposterous. Every stage of life was fixated by the men in their lives. Even after the passing of their male companion, they were under the charge of another male relative. So much for respect for the dead. Instead, in most states, you were lucky enough to receive some form of informal education at home. The schools, of course, were vehemently reserved for the superior gender. Do not even begin to talk about expressing your opinions in public or owning property. Thomas R. Martin's Ancient Greece reports tell us that an heiress with no living male relative, neither a father nor a husband, was legally forced to marry her late father's closest living male relative to bear a son who would be the one to inherit. Oof, disgusting. By 1500, Europe was divided into two types of secular law. One was customary law, which was predominant in northern France, England, and Scandinavia, and the other was Roman-based written law, which was predominant in southern France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Customary laws favored men more than women. For example, inheritance among the elites in Italy, England, Scandinavia, and France was passed on to the eldest male heir. In all of the regions, the laws also gave men substantial powers over the lives, property, and bodies of their wives. However, there were some improvements for women as opposed to ancient customs. For example, they could inherit in the absence of their brothers, do certain trades without their husbands, and widows could receive dower. In areas governed by Roman-based written laws, women were under male guardianships in matters involving property and law, fathers overseeing daughters, husbands overseeing wives, and uncles or male relatives overseeing widows. Throughout Europe, women's legal status centered upon her marital status, while marriage itself was the biggest factor in restricting women's autonomy. Custom, statute, and practice not only reduced women's rights and freedoms, but prevented single or widowed women from holding public office on the justification that they might one day marry. According to English common law, which developed from the 12th century onward, all property which a wife held at the time of marriage became a possession of her husband. Eventually, English courts forbade a husband transferring property without the consent of his wife, but he still retained the right to manage it and receive the money which it produced. French married women suffered from restrictions on their legal capacity, which were removed only in 1965. In the 16th century, the Reformation in Europe allowed more women to add their voices, including the English writers Jane Anger, Amelia Lanier, and the prophetess Anna Trapnell. English and American Quakers believed that men and women were equal. Many Quaker women were preachers. Despite relatively greater freedom for Anglo-Saxon women until the mid-19th century, writers largely assumed that a patriarchal order was a natural order that had always existed. This perception was not seriously challenged until the 18th century, when Jesuit missionaries found matrilineality in native North American peoples. The philosopher John Locke exposed marital inequality and the mistreatment of women during this time. He was well known for advocating for marital equality among the sexes in his work during the 17th century. According to a study published in the American Journal of Social Issues and Humanities, the condition for women during Locke's time were as, quote, English women had fewer grounds for divorce than men until 1923. Husbands controlled most of their wives' personal property until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Children were the husband's property, even though the men didn't give birth to the kids. Rape was impossible within marriage. Wives lacked crucial features of legal personhood since the husband was taken as the representative of the family, thereby eliminating the need for women's suffrage. These legal features of marriage suggest the idea of marriage between equals appeared unlikely to most Victorians. Other philosophers have also made the statements regarding women's rights during this time. For example, Thomas Paine wrote in an occasional letter on the female sex where he states, as quoted, if we take a survey of ages and of countries, we will find the women, almost without exception, adored and oppressed. They are robbed of freedom of will by the laws, yet such, I am sorry to say, is a lot of women over the whole earth. Man with regard to them has been either an insensible husband or an oppressor. A paternal society can find prefer to make women's rights a man's duty. For instance, under English common law, husbands had to maintain their rights. This duty was abolished in 2010. Matrilineality is a tracing of kinship through the female line. It may also correlate with a social system in which each person is identified with their mother's lineage, and which can involve the inheritance of property and or titles. A matriline is a line of descent from a female ancestor to a descendant of either sex in which the individuals in all intervening generations are mothers. In other words, a mother line. In a matrilineal descent system, an individual is considered to belong to the same descent group as their mother. This ancient matrilineal descent pattern is in contrast to the currently more popular pattern of patrilineal descent from which a family name is usually derived. In recent years, evolutionary biologists, geneticists, and paleoanthropologists have been reassessing the issues, many citing genetic and other evidence that early human kinship may have been matrilineal after all. One crucial piece of indirect evidence has been genetic data suggesting that over thousands of years, women among sub-Saharan African hunter-gatherers have chosen to reside postmaritally, not with their husband's family, but with their own mother and other natal kin. Another line of argument is that when sisters and their mothers help each other with childcare, the descent line tends to be matrilineal rather than patrilineal. Biological anthropologists are now widely agreed that cooperative childcare was a development crucial in making possible the evolution of the unusually large human brain and characteristically human psychology. Although others refute the claims of supporters of the universality of matrilocality or patrilocality, pointing out that hunter-gatherer societies have a flexible philopatry or practice multilocality, which in turn leads to a more egalitarian society, since both men and women have the right to choose with whom they live. The 16th and 17th centuries saw numerous witch trials, which resulted in thousands of people across Europe being executed, of whom 75 to 95% were women, depending on time and place. The executions mostly took place in German-speaking lands, and during the 15th century, the terminology witchcraft was definitely viewed as something feminine as opposed to prior years. Famous witchcraft manuals such as the Malleus Maleficarum and Summis Desiderantes depicted witches as diabolical conspirators who worshipped Satan and were primarily women. Culture and art at the time depicted these witches as seductive and evil, further fueling moral panic and fusion with rhetoric from the church. The authors and inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, I don't know how to pronounce that, justified these beliefs by claiming women had greater credulity, impressionability, feeble minds, feeble bodies, impulsivity, and carnal natures, which were flawed, susceptible to evil behavior and witchcraft. These sorts of beliefs at the time could send female hermits or beggars to trials just for offering remedies or herbal medicine. These set of developed myths eventually led to the 16th to 17th century witch trials, which found thousands of women burnt at the stake. I'm shaking my head at the ignorance of men, believing that witches existed and believing that herbal medicine was witchcraft.